Everyone, this is our ESPN sports broadcast on the biomechanics of the track and field start from a novice first pro standpoint. My name is Josh.
I'm Andrew. And I'm Cullen.
And then right off the bat, we'll go right into the different phases of block start. So we have the set position, we have the push phase, and then the first flight stance phase. So in the set position, this is where sprinters, regardless of experience, can pretty much choose the location and placement of two foot plates from the blocks used in the sprint start. And for foot placing, it is important to increase the anterior-posterior distance between the foot plates, which will help increase the push phase and duration within that. And the total impulse given will have a greater block exit velocity for a runner, regardless of experience as well. And the result of having a greater block exit velocity for a sprinter is due to having a greater rear leg force, which will increase greater rear leg kinetic entries as well.
And speaking off of that, in terms of the actual starting blocks, um, so the starting blocks themselves are adjustable so that the runner can pick the best position for them. And there was a study done by Nagahara et al. In 2020 that talks about the foot placement and where the center of pressure is on the actual pad. Um, Basically, it was finding that the posterior loading condition, meaning you put more pressure on the rear pad, can improve your 10-meter time and maybe improve your average horizontal external power for some people. But most improvement comes from better reaction time. And overall, what they found was that where you place, whether you push or push off harder on the front or on the rear, and where on the pad you actually push off doesn't really matter in the overall sprint, but in shorter measures, it might have a measurable improvement at times.
All right, nice. Yep, so then following that, I can get right into the push phase for you guys. So within this phase, the push phase is more motion focused and reaction time has a huge role in this phase, like Andrew was kind of stating. With the push phase, a runner's knees and hips are going to be more extended, and the front leg will reach peak angular velocity, whereas like the rear leg, in a sense, will reach peak angular velocity before like the hip and ankle overall. And then this is due to the rear knee starting from a relatively basically extended angle. And this push phase movement is pretty much what gives a runner the force to create a consistent momentum and movement from a simple starting block position. And while analyzing upper body kinetics within this push phase as well, it has been proposed by Bezotis and Alt that the arms are primarily just to stabilize lower body rotations, but also with the vertical arm motion or swing, this can facilitate a greater leg drive and it can contribute to forwards towards acceleration for runners, like I said, based on experience or non-experience. And although there's been like detailed descriptions overall within arm actions through research, there's not pretty much based evidence on the differences between arm actions for a sprint start performance levels, and more further research in this area is probably going to be necessary to give more emphasis, often placed on like coaches or mentors or even parents within the sport as well.
And building off of that stability part, there was two studies done based on the effect of the width of your stance in the starting blocks and how that affects your stability in your first few steps, especially during that push phase. And as you saw earlier on the starting blocks, there is a forward and back adjustment on the starting blocks, but not a wide adjustment on the starting blocks. And the reason for that is, according to Atsuka et al. In 2015, that the peak power in the rear leg um, is is actually less in the narrower stance. And what that does is it provides you with less rotation to have to counteract in your push phase that allows you to get a better push in your push phase. There was another study done by Sandamas et al. In 2018 um, that kind of focused using force plates on the side-to-side impulses, and they found that kind of reaffirmed that the side-to-side impulses, meaning the stability component, was increased, or the impulses were decreased, stability was increased with the narrower stance.
Yeah, now going on to pretty much joint kinetics, this will be in the first stance position. So in the first stance position, the metatarsal phalange joints are going to be plantar flex dominant through the first stance during your mid acceleration out of the blocks. And the metatarsal phalange joint is going to be mostly stationary or stabilized during like the first half of the stance before you dorsiflex into the next motion while running, and it pretty much acts like an energy absorber from the mid stance before generating momentum and energy as you reach that plantar flexion between before your toe rises basically in that running position overall.
And then one thing to consider too when starting a block, like Andrew was mentioning when we actually had the blocks up here, is reaction time is actually a higher indicator of a faster runner. So when we look between like a novice and a pro sprinter, we can look at reaction time of their actual time to get out of the blocks. And I'm looking at Michael Cummings' article called "What's the Buzz About Reaction Time." A collegiate sprinter has an average reaction time of 190 milliseconds, and a elite level Olympic sprinter has a reaction time of 104 milliseconds. And that number, like around 104, around 100 milliseconds, is actually very important. There's actually a rule inside of track and field that if you start less than 100 milliseconds after the gun goes off, you false started because it's believed that you as a human you actually cannot react that fast. So sprinters try to get as close to that 100 millisecond reaction time as they possibly can.
All right. Yep. And then me and Cullen will actually give you guys kind of a brief analysis on a novice versus pro in a standpoint in the starting block position. So I will be the novice and Cullen will be the pro. And we'll basically just be loading up the starting blocks and we'll get that clip to you right in the next segment.
Okay, so here's an example. Josh is going to get set up here in the blocks and kind of be representative of a more novice sprinter. As you can see, as he's getting set up here, his the blocks themselves are pretty close together. The rear block isn't very far back relative to the front block, um, and his shoulders are pretty far forward over his hands, and he's kind of in a generally unstable position. And you can go ahead and start whenever you want on your own count. Alrighty, and based off of his start there, what you probably saw was that he stood up really fast. It took him one full stride to stand up, which is less than ideal. And also, he had stiff hips and not a whole lot of rotation in his hips as he was getting off the blocks. There's actually a study about the relationship between the pelvic range of motion and performance by Sandamas et al. In 2019, and it found that there was that the combination of pelvic rotation and pelvic tilt plus rear hip flexion, meaning the back swing of that back leg, has a major effect on performance. What it also found was that when you isolate pelvic motion from that first step, it doesn't really correlate with performance. What that basically means is that having the range of motion is important, but how you actually take that first step isn't quite as important because you haven't yet started that push phase.
Okay, so when I coach a set of blocks at a track meet, I always have this like I keep it the same every single time. Most experts try to keep it the same every single time. And I use my feet as a nice measurement as them, and I'm trying to keep a separation between my rear leg and my front leg, so that I can, when I push off, there's somewhere for my leg to actually land when I'm sprinting. One thing too is I like to make sure that when I'm getting into the blocks, I'm really pushing into the back because I'm going to spring off of this. And as I put my fingers onto the ground, I like to like load my shoulders in so that when I stand up, there's a center of gravity change way closer to here. And so when I push, the center of gravity is actually ahead of me, making it easier for me to run.
You want to go ahead and start whenever on your own count.
So breaking down the actual two sprints that we just watched, when we look at mine compared to Josh's, my feet were more like separated, so that way when I pushed, there was actually more of a range of motion in my hips, and I could actually plant my first foot out instead of standing up immediately like how Josh did. When Josh stood up immediately, his center of gravity kind of gets sucked back towards his body, therefore having to work harder for each step afterwards. Where mine, since I stayed low and I got to push through harder, my center of gravity is actually ahead of me, making it easier for me to push through. And when I'm pushing through as I run, I'm trying to push through the balls on my feet and try to push it more of like parallel to the ground way, so that the center of gravity can stay ahead of me as long as possible. I mean, you can't keep that up. You eventually have to stand up, but staying low as long as possible, and then standing up and continuing to drive is what the goal of the block start is. So when we look at like what is something Josh could do to get better, basically, is first I would find a more comfortable leg position between the two. Something that, and when you find the comfortable position, stick to it. You can't keep switching between them. Your body will never get used to that. And then another thing too, he was very lean forward in the beginning. So he had a hard time kind of getting over, like when he went to go push, he had to stand up immediately. His center of gravity is way too far away from him to start. I would try to load my shoulders more and have my weight like on my shoulders and my arms. That way, when I went to go push off, it was more of a natural movement into actual starting my drive phase after my blocks.
Yeah. So we hope you guys enjoyed the segment and learned a lot from it. We'll catch you guys next time. See ya.
Thanks for watching.